What's up, developers? This is chapter 10 of my Cloudflare and Hono course, and in this chapter we will add Drizzle ORM, which will serve as our database management tool. We will add the schema for our subscribers table, and then we will write our first database query to insert a subscriber. So let's jump in. The first thing we need to do is install Drizzle. So I can do that with bun add Drizzle ORM, and then we also want to add in Drizzle kit. And we can do -d because this is a development dependency. All right, and now that we've got those, Drizzle requires a config file. So at the root of our project here, we can add a new file called drizzle.config. There we go. And then we can add in our configurations that we need. So first we'll import define config from Drizzle kit. And now we can export our config object. And then inside of here is where we can add all of our different database options that we need. So in this file specifically, we're going to want to point out where the schema is located. So we can do that with schema, and you see I got some autocomplete there, which is really nice. And taking a look at our folder structure, so we currently don't have a schema, but let's say where do I want to put it is the question. So I want to put it in the server folder. Let's fold up that client one. And then inside of server, I want a database folder. And then inside of that database folder is where the schema can live. So let's add that path in here. So source, server, database, and then the file will be schema.ts. Now we don't have that yet, but we will add it in shortly. And then we also want to tell Drizzle where to put migration files when it generates them for us. So I want to put those in a migrations folder inside of the database folder. So let's go ahead and actually add in that database folder right now. So this is where all of our database stuff will live in one nice little location called DB. Keep it simple. And then we can tell it out to put those migrations into .source, server, database, and migrations. There we go. And Drizzle will automatically create this folder if it doesn't exist for us when we do generate our first migration. Then we need to specify a dialect. So this is a SQLite database, so that will be our dialect. There we go, getting that autocomplete. And then we need to tell it the driver as well, so we get that driver option. And then you can see here we have a few different ones. D1-HTTP is what we want. So that's for, of course, Cloudflare D1. All right, so now that we have this set up, we can go ahead and create our schema. Now we can add that schema file right here inside of our database folder. So we can call this schema.ts. And we're putting it there because that matches up with the path here where we're telling Drizzle where the schema is located, source, server, database, schema. And that's what we have. So server, database, schema. Okay, so now I want to pull up my old system design from chapter 1. If you remember this, down here I had already mapped out what the database should look like. So we're going to need one table called a subscribers table. So when someone is subscribing to our waitlist, we need to save some data. And that data would be these points right here. So their email, created at date, updated at date, traffic source. This could be like LinkedIn or YouTube. We want to try and collect that. Device, either mobile or desktop, to see which experience users are coming in on, and email verified, unsubscribed, and confirmation token. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and add these into our schema.ts file. So jump back over here to VS Code, and we can import a couple things from Drizzle. So we'll start with SQLite table. We're going to need text, integer, and check. And then these can come from Drizzle ORM SQLite core. All right. And then there's one other thing I'm going to import, and that would be SQL from Drizzle ORM. And you'll see in just a minute what we'll use this all for. So for us to map out our database table, we can do that right here in our schema, so that it gives us an easy way to generate migrations. And if we ever need to change this table in the future, we can generate new migrations that will add those new columns or change the columns as needed. So we want to export this, and we'll call this table subscribers. And then we can use our first import, that was the SQLite table. And then you can see here, it's saying we need a table name, and then we can define our columns. So our table name is going to be subscribers. And you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between this and this? This is the table name in the database. This is the table name in our code that we will access and query from. And then we can add our columns as a object here. And first, we're going to need an ID. Every row in a database needs an ID, so we can add our integer, and this we imported right up there. ID, and we'll label this the primary key. So this ID right here, this string, is how it will appear in the database. And then this ID is how we can interact with the object in our code after we query. And primary key will auto increment for us, implicitly makes the column auto incrementing. So we don't actually need to provide the ID when creating a subscriber record in the database. It will do that for us automatically. So then we want to add in a column for email. And this will be text. And this must be not null. If it's null, we want the database to throw an error and not save anything. Because if we don't have an email, that's no good to us. This is a waitlist where we are capturing emails so we can notify people about our product. And then we'll also tack on that unique. We definitely want the emails to be unique. We don't want duplicates in our database. That's pointless for us. And then it's always good to add a created at and updated at column so that we can keep track of when rows were created in our database. It's very helpful for debugging and just knowledge of our system. All right, so let's break this down really quick. So created at, you see it's an integer, which might seem a little strange. You'd think that the created at would be a date, but for SQLite, it doesn't have native date functionality built in. So the way we keep track of dates is as an integer. And luckily, it already has some functionality built in to do that for us. So created at, we do this with the underscore. So that's how columns are normally titled inside of a database, is with underscores, and then JavaScript is camel case. So you see the difference there. And then we can call it the mode of timestamp, and then not null, but then we default it with a new date, and then we will see that integer timestamp in the database. And now we can do the same thing for updated at. There we go. All right, and then the next column that we're going to need will be the traffic source. This will be text. And this does not require any other options chained on. This is an optional field, so we will leave it just like that. And then our next column will be device. This can also be text. And then we want to add email verified. This will be a timestamp, so we're going to treat it a lot like the created at. So it will be an integer. The column header will be email verified. And the mode of timestamp. There we go. All right, and then after that, we will add an unsubscribed column. And this will also be a timestamp. And just copy that so I don't have to re-type it out. There we go. And then our last column here will be the confirmation token. And this will also be optional. And if you remember from the system design chapter, the confirmation token will be used to verify a person's email. So they will receive an email after signing up, and then they can click the link in the email to verify, and then we will put a timestamp when we verify them, and the link will have this confirmation token and match up here so that we're verifying the correct email in the database. We wouldn't want to verify someone else's email. So that's the purpose of that. And then there's another thing that I want to add to this table, and that is a check. So if you see up here, I imported this check and I imported the SQL, but I haven't used them yet. So here's how we're going to use those. We can add down here a function to our table. And then inside of here, we can add a check. So what this will do is it will check a certain column up here, and we can add in some kind of validation. And so I'm looking at the email column. So I don't want somebody to be able to type in some kind of fake email like invalid, something like that. So in order to prevent that, we can add a little bit of basic validation. So we can just make sure that whatever value is coming in, it has an @ symbol and a dot in it. So not the most comprehensive, but we will also use Zod later to validate the email. So we will validate it in 2 places to keep our database safe and make sure that we're getting real emails coming in. So what we can do is we can add email right here. That is the name of the database column we want to check. And then we can use this SQL function from up here. And this lets us add in some raw SQL that will run on this column. So we can add in the table.email. There we go. And then I want to say is like percent at percent dot percent. So these are wildcards. So we are verifying that whatever value comes in, it has something before the @ symbol, something after a dot, and something after that. So if some email is completely malformed, then this will throw an error. It will check on our email column and throw an error for us. And that's what we want. Cool. So now that's it for our schema. There's one last thing we want to do in this file is we can export the type, the TypeScript type. So if we're going to create a new subscriber, we can export type of new subscriber, and we can infer that from our subscribers table. Subscribers dot, and then we can see infer insert and infer select. And so if this was a new subscriber, we are inserting that. So there we go. We can now get this type, and if we hover over it, it'll tell us what should be included when creating a new subscriber. So this will be really handy when we write our query in just a minute. So now that we have a database table here, well, we have the schema, we want to sync this to our database. We want to get this table inside of our database. So how do we do that? Well, that's where Drizzle migrations come in. So if we jump over to our package.json, we can add some new scripts to help us out. So first, we're going to add in database generate. And so DrizzleKit will generate the SQL for us that will create our schema table inside of our database. So to do that, we just add DrizzleKit generate. So nothing too crazy there. And now let's go ahead and run this command and see what happens. All right, so let's take a look at the output here. So it used our default drizzle.config.ts, and then it created one table of subscribers with 9 columns, and it says your SQL migration file is available here. So let's take a look at that. If we come over database migrations, it created the migrations directory for us. It also added in some metadata here, and we could take a look at this. So it just keeps track of all the different migrations and a snapshot. But generally, we're not going to edit those files at all. Those will be managed by DrizzleKit by that script. But this file here is an SQL file. So it's got this nice, funny, Mighty Toadmen auto-generated name to it. And we can see it's creating the table subscribers. And here are all of our columns as we specified. So awesome. Now that we have this raw SQL, we can run this, and Cloudflare D1 will be able to apply this migration to the D1 database. So let's close out of that. And in order to apply the migrations, run the migrations, we need another script. So we'll call this database migrate local. So we're going to run the migration on our local database first so we can test it out and make sure it doesn't blow up or anything. And the way we run the migration is with the Wrangler CLI. So we can use Wrangler d1 migrations apply, and then we need to specify the name of the database. So for me, that is dojo local db. And if you forgot the name of your database, you can come back over here. And so this D1 database is my local. So database name, dojo local db. And then back over here to package. Then we want to do -- local. So that tells Wrangler to run the migrations on our local database right here. So let's go ahead and run that and make sure that it works. So I can copy this script, and here, let me move that directory over. Say bun run. All right, so we got a warning and an error. So let's take a look at this. And here we can see resource location of local. Good, that's what we want. And it's saying no migrations folder found. Set migrations dir in your Wrangler JSON file. And then here the error, no migrations present at my root/migrations. So what's happening is it's looking for the migration file in the wrong place. So we can fix that really easily. Let's go ahead and copy that and then come back over to our Wrangler JSON. And inside of here, we can add that migrations dir, and we can tell it where to look. So our migrations are in this folder. So let's point it to that. We can do /source server database migrations. And then we're going to want to add this to our other database as well. So we have our staging database, add a comma on the end there. And so when we run migrations on staging, it will also look for the migrations in the correct folder. And we will do that for the production database. We don't have a production database yet, but we will add our production environment in a future chapter soon. So for now, though, we can just add that configuration to these two databases. Okay, so now that we have that, let's try rerunning our script. So if I pull this up, run database migrate local. And all right, so let's take a look at this. So running on resource local, good. And migrations to be applied, the mighty toadmen.sql. Perfect, that's our migration. That's the one we created. And it says about to apply one migration. Your database may not be available to serve requests during the migration. Continue. And this is a local database, so that doesn't matter at all. So I clicked yes. And there we go. It successfully ran that migration. Okay, so how do we know that it actually worked? Well, let's come back up to our .wrangler file where our local database lives, open up the state, open up D1, and click on this, and now we can see what's going on. So we've got some metadata, we've got our D1 migrations, and hey, there we can see it, Mighty Toad Men. So it kept track of that migration, and then here is our subscribers table. So we now have ID, email, created at, updated at, traffic source, etc. So the migration was successful. We can see that everything ran, and we now have our subscribers table in our local database. Now we can go ahead and add a very similar script for our staging and production databases. So now we don't have the production database yet, but we can still make the script now so we have it ready to go. So we can call this database migrate staging and database migrate prod. And then what we want to do is change the database name. So dojo local is not what I need there. I need this one, database dojo staging database. Paste that there. And then instead of -- local, we're going to say -- remote. And then we can specify a -- environment of staging. And this staging environment needs to match up with our Wrangler JSON-C environment staging. And I just realized since I don't have a production database, I don't have a name. So yeah, I will go ahead and remove that line there. That script we won't be able to use until we do create our production database. But for now, this will run the migration on our staging database. So let's give it a try. Let's first jump over to our dashboard. All right. And then inside of here, I can go check out my database. So my D1 SQL database, Dojo staging. And if we explore data, there is no data to explore. Our list of tables would be right here. So there's nothing in there right now, but let's change that. Let's jump back over here. And if we run this migration file on staging, then we should see our subscribers table inside of our staging database. So bun run database migrate staging. And there we're getting similar logs. So resource location remote, yep, which means it's running out on the internet. And that's the migration we want. And we're going to say yes. And it ran successfully. So let's jump back over to our dashboard. And if I hit refresh, there we go. We can now see we've got the D1 migrations. So there's our migration, Mighty Toadmen. And here's our subscribers table, which is empty right now. But hey, we've got our table in there and everything is looking good. So now that we have our subscriber table in our database, we need a way to connect to our database and actually run queries. So to do that in our application, we can go to our server database folder, and inside of here, we're going to create a file specifically for connecting to the database. So I like to call this db.ts so that it's clear that this is kind of the root connection. And then inside of here, we can import Drizzle, which will enable the connection for us. So let's do that. And then Drizzle has several different imports. So we want to make sure we're importing from D1. So Drizzle ORM / D1. There we go. So we're getting the right connection. And then what we want to do is also import our schema. So we can import star as schema from schema.ts. All right. And then let's go ahead and export const get database. Now inside of this function, we can connect to our database with Drizzle. So let's do const db equals Drizzle. And then this function requires two arguments, this client of a Miniflare D1 database and a config. So where do we get the client Miniflare D1 database? Well, it needs to be passed into the function. And this will actually be the binding for the Cloudflare database. So the binding would be this right here. So if we jump back over here, we will add in this binding variable. And then right now, this doesn't have a type. It's implicitly a type of any. But luckily for us, Cloudflare has some worker types we can import. or install, I should say. So to do that, we can say bun add dash d at Cloudflare workers dash types. All right, now that I've got that installed, I can import that type, D1 database. All right, and now I can set that binding to that type, D1 database. All right, there we go. So now this binding can go right here, and then we can add in our schema as our options. And so that will get us a connection to our database, and we can then return that database connection. Now, since we're just declaring this and then returning it, we can actually remove this line and just return like that, and saves us a line of code. Then we can also export the get database type so that we can use that later. The type of get db. All right, and then if we hover over that, it'll tell us that we have a Drizzle D1 database. So that'll be handy later for querying, and that'll do it for our connection. So now that we have a way to connect to our database, we can actually write a query. So let's go ahead and do that. Over here in the database directory, let's add a new file called queries. And inside of here, I want to create a query to insert a subscriber into our database. So we're going to need a couple of imports. So let's import the type of D1 database from Cloudflare workers. Let's also get our database connection that we just created. So get db. And then we want to grab our new subscriber type so that we can use that. There we go. And then we can import our schema here as well. Cool. Now let's create a function called insert subscriber. And this will be asynchronous because it's connecting to our database, which could, whenever you're inserting or querying data, can take an extra second. So that's why we do async for any database related logic. And then what are we going to pass to this function? So we're going to pass it the data for the subscriber, and also we're going to pass it the D1 binding. So we'll call that the D1 database, and that will be the type of D1 database. And then we can say new subscriber, but with a lowercase n. And this will be the type of new subscriber. There we go. And then we do our arrow function, and we have the body of our function. So our function will accept these two parameters. And then now what do? Well, first we need to connect to our database, get that database connection. So we can do that with that function, just get db, and then we need to pass it the binding. Just like that. And now that we have a connection to our database, we can query. And so this will be an insert query. So we could say await database.insert. And then we need to tell it where we're inserting into. So that's where the schema comes in, schema.subscribers so insert into the subscribers table. And then what are we inserting? So we got to specify the values. And what we're inserting is the new subscriber. And that new subscriber, we can see right there. And when we hover over it, we get that type safety. Thank you, TypeScript. These are the values that will be passed in. And then we can add one more thing chained on, and that is returning. So that will return the new subscriber. And so since we're returning something, we can set it to a variable. So we'll set that to result. And then if we hover over result, we can see we get an ID email created at all these different columns for our subscriber. And the ID is created automatically. And then we also see that it's coming back as an array of objects. So we're only going to be inserting one subscriber at a time when calling this function. So we can actually extract that one subscriber. And then if we return result and we hover over this, we can see we're no longer inside of an array. We are just returning the one newly created subscriber. So now that we have this function to insert subscribers, how do we know that this actually works? Well, we need to set up some testing and test this function out. And I'm going to save that testing for the next chapter because there's a little bit of setup that comes with setting up a test database. So that's all for now. Happy coding and Godspeed.